Montana is a place where people have abundant opportunities to connect with the world, renowned fish, wildlife, and state parks resources that define our state, and where a responsive and relevant FWP has resiliency and public support it needs to lead the way in making sure these resources remain an essential part of Montana's culture, economy, and high quality of life. Montanans have long recognized that the fish, wildlife, and state parks resources necessary to maintain their treasured lifestyle require stewardship. So in 1901, they created an agency known today as Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, responsible for managing and conserving those resources.
Our department is charged, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is charged with ensuring wildlife remains in Montana for now and future generations. That would be, our vision or our mission statement, to perpetuate wildlife on the landscape for future generations. So we work with a variety of other government sister agencies and as well as the Montana legislature and organizations such as sportsmen and women's groups, private landowners, and in essence all stakeholders to accomplish that mission statement. So from a legal framework side of things, the state of Montana is charged with managing wildlife, for the public as a public resource. And that public would include you as a visitor to the state of Montana, because the wildlife belongs to all. And so that's what we go about. And you just were in Yellowstone National Park, where they manage on a singular landscape of the park, but they work also in concert with us too for the same goals and purposes in general. Theirs is a preservation model, ours is a conservation model, which includes our funding comes from those who enjoy our recreational resources through harvest and hunting and fishing. So our funding source is licensed dollars from those we serve.
How do people perceive the concept of owning wildlife species and national habitat in Montana?
Very well. I mean, Montana is a western state, very steeped in tradition. Many of us who grew up here were born here. Some of us, like myself, had to go somewhere else to find work initially, and then came back home. And came back home with the purpose of family, came back home with the purpose of Montana's called the last best place. And we, many Montanans believe that. It is what some other parts of the U.S. used to be. It's very large geographically, it's very diverse geographically. It's also very diverse with the people that inhabit here and the values and things. There's a very broad range of perspectives. And another good way to describe what you ask is, if you were to look at the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, and the Greater that serves southwest Montana is a newspaper, more often than not, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks issues are on the front page of the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. And a lot of people are very passionate and care about our wildlife resources, their recreational opportunities. Often I tell my staff that, we have the privilege of working in a field, and in the field of southwest Montana, out amongst our Fish, Wildlife, and Parks resources, in the very arena that other people spend all week in a cubicle working, so that they can take that time, their time off, to go out and enjoy what we do every day. And with that is, it's a pretty big responsibility, steeped in tradition, like I said, steeped in purpose. Everyone has an opinion on Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, because they're very passionate one way or another. Because they're very passionate, their opinions vary at times, and we can be on the receiving end of negative side of things too, because everyone has their own perspective on how we should handle things such as grizzly bears, how we should handle bison management, all those kind of things. One of our most recent challenges that tested our purpose is the fish kill on the Yellowstone and the need to make a very difficult but needed decision to close the river to all use for a period of time to make sure that we don't negatively impact unnecessarily populations to where we hurt the long term. The balance of what happens today, both socially, recreational, and economically, with what we are stewards of, and that's the future.
What are the major challenges in wildlife conservation?
I think, today it would have to be, there's some overarching ones of habitat, and loss of habitat are critical. You look at things like the potential listing of sage-grouse that we didn't list them, and the work that Montana's done provided a case for not having to list a species. But that took a lot of work, and it took securing additional habitat. Again, it took, in the big hole, or sage-grouse, it took work with landowners. Grayling was the same thing. We avoided a listing process by working with private landowners and keeping enough water in the rivers to avoid that negative situation. Finding, from my perspective in this part of the world, I'll speak to two species. Bison is one, and grizzly bears will be another. We're in the process of delisting them. We're in the process, ongoing, continuing process of figuring out how and where a species fits on the landscape. And the best success story can be pointed at to the work that's been done here, I think, on grizzly bears. We manage grizzly bears on a ecosystem scale. We manage grizzly bears on a social scale. There are places where grizzly bears are now exploring out, and we have them much further west than we used to from Yellowstone. They're coming down from Glacier as well. And they're in places where they haven't been for a very long time. Figuring out how those species can, and bears in this instance, can live acceptably on that landscape requires management. And there are some places that they come in conflict. And if there's too much conflict, or if it's not the right place, they can't be. There are some places they can't be. I can't have, so in the fall here, starting now, it could even be right now, there are black bears within a mile of this office in the city of Bozeman. Okay? They come in the fall on the stream corridors in search of food, and they're mostly nocturnal, and they're eating choke cherries along, but they will also then at times get into garbage cans. Okay? They'll get into gardens, they'll get into bird feeders. And some of the things we struggle with, is this a bear issue, or is it a people management issue? Largely, we consider it a people management issue until the conflict gets to a level that is no longer safe in the best interest of the bear or in the best interest of the people. And then we will, put out a culvert trap and we'll remove and move those animals. But part of a successful management program for grizzly bears, for instance, is tolerance is a social thing. There's a social tolerance, there's a political tolerance, there is having them learning to live on the landscape. And with grizzly bears, part of a successful management program is also knowing when to say when on an individual animal basis. It's a very difficult thing to have to make a decision to put that bear down that's on the wall right now. But for the good of the species and tolerance throughout, if it's a conflict situation that can't be remedied, you have to lose some of the individuals for the sake of the broader conversation and the credibility that comes with living up to what we said we would do. We expect people to live with bears until the situation becomes untenable, and then we have to deal with that. And the same thing can be said for bison. It's a little different with buffalo, but there's tolerance, by and large, because there's other areas where there's not. There's some places they won't ever fit on the landscape. There's some places that we haven't explored yet that they might. But in southwest Montana, on a very limited scale, we're finding ways and using adaptive management to see where they fit.
In the issue of poaching and wildlife trafficking, how is the situation like in the U.S.? As in Tanzania, poaching and wildlife trafficking is alarmingly high.
From a scale, from what I know of talking, of understanding where you guys are coming from, talking to other countries in the same area of Kenya and different things over the years, it's grave, but you have it, it's much graver there. Poaching, we do have a significant amount of poaching. I spent 20-some years in our law enforcement end of things. I spent 5.5 years in our undercover unit of trying to track down criminal investigations, the most serious undercover kind of poaching kind of things. And you put a value on wildlife, okay? When you put an economic value on wildlife, it makes it very difficult, especially, you encompass what that value is compared to economic status of things. We have, commercialized poaching, for money is a problem no matter where it is. It's a stealing of a public resource for all, for the benefit of a few. And you take into account, does it become socially acceptable as well? Is it okay to poach a lion for under certain circumstances where it may not be acceptable to poach something else? I think those things transcend national boundaries. There's a certain segment of the population that no matter how much you educate, no matter how much you try, will prefer to steal those resources for their own gain instead of conserving them for everyone for the future. And I think, if you were to talk to my enforcement staff and your enforcement staff sitting down next to each other, it would take about 3 minutes to have a common thread, and they've faced the same exact problems, the same situations, the same kind of investigations, just on 2 separate continents.
The wildlife biologist for Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks tells us on her role.
Okay, I do survey and inventory, so I do counts and classifications of all the species and then set corresponding hunting seasons and regulations. That helps us balance hunter opportunity, any game damage on private lands, and make sure that we have sustainable populations into the future. As a result, I do a lot of work with habitat and work with landowners, public and private, work with hunter access, and work with the research division. We're learning about disease and different aspects of population ecology of the critters I'm responsible for managing for our public. Mm-hmm. We do a lot of surveys from the air. So I have a Piper Super Cub fixed-wing aircraft that I use. I should say I don't have it. I don't fly it. We have a contract pilot who flies, and I do the counting and classification. And we do that. I use a fixed wing if it's not in mountainous or rugged terrain. I use a helicopter if it is, or for a species like mule deer, which are highly mobile. And so we need something that's maneuverable. So the state of Montana has its own aircraft division. So I use our state pilot for the helicopter to go for species like mountain goats and mule deer. We survey in winter because that's when animals are concentrated, usually. Today, it's fall, I was surveying sandhill cranes. They stage in agricultural areas along the river bottoms before they migrate south to Texas. So every survey and inventory method is related to the biology of the species. Because I work mostly with ungulates, most ungulates congregate in winter, making it the time to survey. Mountain goats, we actually survey a little more in summer. Then other technologies I use do include radio collars. We collar animals to learn where they go, and there are some exciting developments in radio collar world. There's this new Global Star satellite system, which is pretty cost effective. Our flight time is about $200 an hour for a fixed wing. It's about $400 to $800 an hour for a helicopter. Now, for $1,000 or less, you can get a radio collar that will send you via the internet a location a day, 2 locations a day, and text message you if your animal dies. Really cost effective. If you think about every flight could be $1,000 for a flight. So these radio collars are really informative when animals move to unexpected places, or if I want to learn about a migratory corridor that I want to try to maintain. I was just at a conference learning about the importance of that with mule deer and pronghorn and other species. Right now I have this technology out for me on bighorn sheep that I've been monitoring. And so we do mark resites. We've got marked animals, a known quantity of marked animals, and you can look at the proportions of marked versus unmarked animals and get at your population ecology that way, and you can get at mortality rates. So those are some examples of the technology I use. We also do surveys. I do a lot on foot. If something's amiss in one of my aerial surveys, I'll go out on the ground. I'll have boots on the ground, go out in the truck, go out on horseback. I've done surveys by raft, whitewater rafting to a remote location, or I've done surveys on four-wheelers, motorcycles, any tool it takes to get the data we need.
How do people perceive the concept of owning wildlife species and national habitat in Montana?
Sometimes one of our challenges is we have 2 different landowners right next to each other with different values. One landowner may wish to have lots of wildlife. That's why they bought the land. They want to have 1,000 elk and they love it. They want to hunt the elk and outfit for the elk. And the neighbor could not have, maybe doesn't have the same financial resources, and the elk could be devastating to them. And that's right across the fence line, and so it is a challenge.
The issue of human-wildlife conflict is at large in many communities living around park areas. I ask, what is her advice on such a matter?
Well, first, I think it takes a lot of listening. I've heard it said, and I agree, living and relating to the community is really important. To understand the interactions with the neighbors and the day-to-day life of the people who are there, to really understand what they are experiencing. One thing that's a challenge is we're working with wild animals who have a right to be on that landscape, and we're working with people in private land rights, and they have a right to their livelihoods as well. Balance in all things, being able to move between different value systems. There's a lot of value systems of the publics that we're all responsive to, and seeking whatever we can in terms of compromise or balance is the big challenge. It's not a good answer to you as far as advice, but I think listening as much as possible to all the publics and all the stakeholders is paramount, because there's always another side, there's always another angle. Everybody has got some amount of, we'd say, skin in the game. And trying to figure out how to make it all work is a challenge that I face every day and think about every day. And hopefully we'll reach resolution through communication and mutual respect. I think that displaying respect for every stakeholder is incredibly important, because I mean, these folks' values, you can't judge somebody's values. Your values are right or wrong. It doesn't go like that. It's more, I understand this is important to you. And hearing that and thinking, how can I fit that with the values of others and with the conservation of a species? It's a huge challenge, can't be done alone. You need to have lots of cooperators and partners, and think on a big scale. Try to help where you can, but sometimes you help one person, another person views it as being harmed. So, but open communication is paramount.
It's got tight mountainous roads and it's a one-lane road is beyond me, but go fix it.
A law enforcer, Justin Ferdes, explained on his perspective how laws, rules, and regulations are adhered by the community.
I think for the most part, people understand what they are. There's always certain people that we have to educate a little bit more to understanding, what is required of them when they're out recreating, whether they're hunting or fishing. We certainly here in Bozeman, we have to educate homeowners and landowners about some of the bear issues, food attractants, that sort of thing that we see out and that attract bears and end up getting into trouble, whether it's breaking into houses or spreading garbage across the street. That's certainly something that people aren't aware of, that is a law that they're required to store those attractants. So I would say it's a little bit of a mixed bag, whether people understand the law or they just choose to ignore it sometimes.
Okay, let's just cite one example, like breaking one's house.
Mm-hmm.
This incidents has happened here.
We've had it happen pretty much throughout the state, I guess. Anywhere there's bears and people together, they can get into trouble. We've had bears just this year south of here in the Tom Minor Basin that have broken into houses. Usually they're just looking for food, whether they've been accustomed to getting food in that area before and they're just out there looking for it. They have a very good sense of smell, so if there's food in an area, whether it's in a car, they've broken into cars before too. If you store it in a car, they can get in there and cause some damage for sure. So.
Yeah. Okay, if that happens, what is the action taken? Is there any compensation?
Not compensation like monetary. Typically we will decide what needs to be done with the bear in conjunction with our wildlife biologists and our bear specialists. And if we need to go set a live trap and trap the animal, and then the decision is made kind of cooperatively whether or not that animal should be relocated or euthanized.
What is the major challenge in you doing your work?
I think the major challenge for me is understanding whether someone is just ignorant of a law or whether they're choosing to break the law and whether they understand it and they just are disregarding it. Fish and wildlife laws, just kind of by default, if you look at our regulations, are pretty thick because there's lots of different populations of animals, lots of different species of animals, and it's a large state, so they can be kind of complicated, and we kind of have to take into account whether this person's intent was to break the law or if they just didn't understand the law.
I've heard much about hunting, but now let's talk about fishing.
Sure.
What is the procedure here?
So,
One wants to,
yep. So fishing in the state of Montana, you're required to have a license for game fish, non-game fish. Pretty much the only place you're not required to have a license is on a private pond. So anyone you see on any of the rivers that we see out and about here on the rivers or lakes is required to have a fishing license. And that's one of our major violations we run into are people that haven't purchased a fishing license for that year. You're allowed, depending on the water, to keep certain species and certain numbers of those species. So those are all things we enforce when it comes to fishing.
anything you would like to share with us that we don't know about the thing that you're doing here?
I think that, and we've touched on a little bit of it, we are enforcement. We carry guns. We go to law enforcement academy, but a big part of our job is educating the public. It's not just writing people tickets, taking people to jail. It's a lot of education and a lot of cooperative work with the wildlife biologists when it comes to the game damage issues and the bear issues that we see in this area.
Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, through its employees and citizens, commission and board provides for stewardship of the fish, wildlife parks, and recreational resources of Montana, while contributing to the quality of life for present and future generations.